So what's the Great Awakening? Who knows? What we call the First Great Awakening doesn't have an exact beginning or end. There was not one location or even the easily definable impact that it had. Even the Great Awakening is a title that's applied after the fact. There wasn't anyone walking around saying, hey, isn't this a great awakening? Nevertheless, it was one of the most monumental changes in American society prior to the War for Independence. So what can we know about this Great Awakening? Essentially, what we're talking about is a series of revivals. Hundreds of revival meetings that drew tens of thousands of people, changing individual lives in American culture. Beginning in the 1730s, preachers like Jonathan Edwards in Massachusetts, Gilbert Tennent in Pennsylvania, and the most famous George Whitefield led huge revivals with a focus on the rebirth of the sinner. In 1740, hundreds of thousands of people flocked to hear Whitefield preach as he went all around America. He was easily the most famous person in America for years. See, in Protestant Christianity, revivals are simply church services that are meant to revive people, which literally means to bring one back from the dead. People are spiritually dead, asleep to the truth, and they need to wake up, hence the term Great Awakening. So now, if you're not familiar with Protestant Christianity, especially what's commonly called Calvinist or Reformed theology, then it's important to grasp how these people understood humans' relationship with God. So basically, we are born completely tainted by sin. We are not on good terms with God. The only chance we have is through faith in the atoning power of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. But this is important. Most Christians also believe that people were so corrupt that they were incapable of even wanting God's salvation. It was only the elect, those chosen by God to have their hearts turned, that could realize their sinfulness and desire God's forgiveness. And for a lot of people, this is really troubling. I mean, how do you know if you're one of God's elect? Maybe you don't believe enough. Maybe you don't love God enough. This is cause for serious anxiety and depression. Many people are desperately seeking hope and assurance. And that is exactly what the Great Awakening preachers are trying to bring. The message that you can be born again. Your heart can be instantly cleansed and you are made a new person in the sight of God. And that is a joyous thing to celebrate. The Awakening preachers also insisted that you needed to feel this rebirth. It was more than just an intellectual concept saying, oh yes, I believe in this thing. It was an emotional, overwhelming experience that transformed you at the heart. And it's that emotional experience that caused real problems in society. Conservatives did not approve of the enthusiasm of the revivalists. As the revivals grew more popular, more preachers held revivals, sometimes in the field or in the woods, with people camping there for days at a time. And some of the people who were preaching had no training or no ordination by a church. It seemed to be getting out of control. Some people are running around, rolling on the ground, going into trances, and some even claim to directly hear the voice of God. The wildest incident occurred in New London, Connecticut, when James Davenport, an ordained minister and Yale graduate, led burnings of sinful material. On March 7, 1743, Davenport told his followers to burn their fancy clothes because these were signs of vanity. So people started throwing expensive coats and hats and gloves and all such into the fire. And then all of a sudden, here's a pair of pants on the fire. And not just anyone's pants, the preacher's pants. That's right, James Davenport had taken off his pants in front of everyone and tossed them on the fire. Now this was too much. A woman was able to snatch them up quickly and threw them back in his face, told him he had lost his mind. And Davenport soon issued a public apology. Now for some American colonists, Davenport's fiery pants were just the last proof they needed to show that the awakening was out of control. And that's important to understand. The awakening was very divisive. So-called old lights and new lights fought over the attitudes and behaviors that suffused the revival. Thousands of people left churches they thought were not evangelical enough and joined new congregations outside of the traditional authority. Now, beyond the Civil War, this was about as divisive as any time in American history. But on another level, it did help to create a new sense of Americanism when before people had considered the colonies separate entities. The awakening happened across colony borders, from Massachusetts to South Carolina, and everyone followed the news of it. New colleges like Dartmouth, Brown, Rutgers, and Princeton were all established by people sympathetic to the new lights of the awakening. Printing of newspapers and pamphlets exploded to feed the curiosity about the movement, and this media would continue to influence political opinions going forward. The awakening led many colonials to see the French and Indian War as a contest between the true Protestant religion and Catholicism. For many American colonists, it gave a new religious fervor to everything they did. So if you're a Christian or a believer, this is simple. This is spreading of the gospel. But even if you don't believe in God, you can easily see how a person who did believe could be completely consumed by the movement and see it as the sole purpose of their life, even if just to feel a psychological need. Many women participated in the revivals, and some even preached, but that was frowned on by most awakening ministers. This was also the first time a significant number of English colonists began teaching enslaved Africans about Christianity, and a few condemned slavery as wicked. Just try to imagine African American culture without the church. Regardless of how you feel about Christianity, there's no doubt that African American history would be dramatically different without it. But perhaps the most significant effects, at least indirectly, included American independence and the separation of church and state. Now, I'm not saying that the awakening caused the revolution, but as many people left their old congregations and started new ones, and as formerly fringe denominations like the Baptists grew in popularity, people became a little more accustomed to a challenging authority. And if you challenge the authority of a minister who claims to represent God Almighty, it's easier to challenge a parliament or a king across the ocean. Finally, we must remember that the early colonies were in no way established to ensure religious freedom as people understand it today. The Pilgrims and Puritans came to be an example of righteousness to the ungodly, not to live and let live. Almost every colony had an established religion that taxes supported. And especially in the 1600s, challenging its authority or practicing other types of Christianity were punished. But during the awakening, different denominations found common ground on the importance of conviction of sin and rebirth. George Whitefield welcomed many denominations that believed the basic gospel message. This led to many American Christians being a little more tolerant of other variants of Christianity, and more of them came to dislike the notion of government establishment of any church. So as I said at the beginning, it's hard to describe exactly what the Great Awakening was in exact terms because it wasn't one thing, and it didn't have one exact effect. Nevertheless, it was a monumental shift in American culture that rippled through everything that followed: the Revolution, the Constitution, the Abolition movement, Civil War, etc. We could see the effects all around us. The next time you're out driving around, try and count how many churches you see. There's one on every corner. And how many denominations will you see? That's the awakening. Wake up! These pants are on fire! Are you awake?